Welcome back to our third panel, and this is the first of two structural fixes panels that we'll be talking about. The first one today, and then tomorrow at noon. We're really fortunate to have the three panelists: Jay Hamilton, who's the Hirsch Professor of Communication and Director of the Stanford Journalism Program at Stanford University; Larissa Litsky, who is the Dean and the Judge Leedy Professor of Law at the University of Missouri School of Law; and Rasmus Nielsen, Professor of Political Communication and Director of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at the University of Oxford. Well, what we're going to talk about now is the problem being the media apocalypse, and what various policy levers we might have at our disposal: antitrust, tax, the law of nonprofit entities, government funding, data privacy regulation, regulation of social media and search engines, various ways of trying to deal with the problem of the disappearing newspaper, journalists, public interest, news gathering organizations. The problem, as Penny Abernathy talked in the first session and also in report on the news deserts, basically over the last 15 years, there have been more than 1 in 5 newspapers in the United States have shuttered, and the number of journalists working for newspapers have been cut in half. And that has led to these ghost papers and to what she has called news deserts, that is, these local communities that do not have access to high quality or maybe even any form of local news. So before we talk about the fixes, I thought I might just talk and ask our various panelists how they diagnose the problem. Why are we bleeding newspapers so badly? Obviously, the answer is going to have to be something to do with the internet. But the question is why? What is it? And how might we get a good grasp on the problem that we aim to solve? So first thing, I'd like to ask Jay Hamilton, who's a media economist, and maybe give a kind of his sense as to why we have this conference.
And thank you for organizing the conference. It's like a living syllabus for a media course. When journalists tell stories that change lives and laws, the benefits often spill over onto people who are not their readers or viewers. And it's very hard for them to monetize these benefits. And what that means is that there are a set of stories that would pass a social cost benefit test, but not a market test. In the language of economics, we're dealing with market failures of public goods and positive externalities. So if you think about this, information itself is a public good. It's non-rival. My consumption of a fact doesn't prevent you from consuming it. It's non-exclusive. You can consume that fact even if you didn't pay for it. The accountability that people were talking about this morning that arises from covering a school board or covering a city council, that accountability itself is a public good. We all want to live in communities where people have an education reporter. We'd much rather watch Netflix than read that type of coverage. If you think about becoming an informed citizen, Anthony Downs a long time ago wrote in a Stanford Econ PhD thesis a book called The Economic Theory of Democracy. And he basically said, in your life as a consumer or worker or audience member, you seek out information because you get the benefits. But when you're a voter, even if you care a lot about an outcome, and even if more information would help you make a better decision from the standpoint of your preferences, the statistical probability that you have an impact is so small, costs outweigh the benefits and you remain rationally ignorant about the details of politics. What that means is that there's something different about journalism markets, this public goods, positive externalities. And there are a set of people in Washington who I got to meet when I was working with Steve Waldman at the FCC as a consultant on the report on information needs of communities. There are a set of people who think there's nothing special about this market. They believe that the public interest is defined by the public's interest. An FCC chairman from the 1980s famously said, TV is just a toaster with pictures. Or another FCC chair, when asked about the digital divide, said, there's a Mercedes divide. I'd like one, but I can't afford it. But fundamentally, when you think about information markets, there is this problem of stories that go untold. I know there are other problems. People will be talking about antitrust in the platforms. The market for truth is also a problem. That can be reframed again with rational ignorance. There's one other thing I'd like to note that was taught. We talked this morning about the information lives of low-income individuals. When you think about the 5 incentives that lead people to create information, they are subscription, which is pay me. There's I want to sell your attention, that's advertising. There's I want to change how you think about the world, that's nonprofit. There's I want your vote, that's partisan, and I just like to talk, that's self-expression. And we're seeing a rearrangement of those incentives in terms of the creation of journalism away from advertising towards subscription and nonprofit. If you think about low-income communities, folks are less likely to have money to spend on subscriptions, less likely for many products to be the marginal consumer, less likely to be the marginal voter. So there are a set of stories in those communities that go untold. So stepping back, when I look at this challenge, I basically think about it as the underproduction of local public affairs reporting. And that's why when I think about structural fixes, I think about lowering the cost of discovering stories with better use of data and algorithms. But that's basically the setup I see: positive externalities, public goods, under provision.
Okay, terrific. So would this be a fair way to summarize what you said? And you said a lot, but just as is, like there's a supply and a demand problem, right? Thus, when it comes to the provision of public interest news, one is the supply is the fact that there are these positive spillovers and that private actors aren't able to monetize those spillovers in order for the invisible hand to generate the socially appropriate amount of information. So like it may turn out that investigative journalism brings to light certain corruption, but local communities who benefit from the corruption being eliminated, the newspaper can't monetize that surplus, and so they're going to produce less of it. But then there's the demand part too, which is that frankly, citizens aren't really that into the news. You point out for issues having to do with rational ignorance, but it seems as if it's like the old story about the restaurant, which is that the food is bad, but at least the portions are small. It's like it's like people don't want it, and markets aren't going to produce it or produce nearly enough of it anyway. Is that like a fair way to describe the basic problem?
I think it is, with one modification. So on the demand side, you're exactly right. Rational ignorance set up a gap between what people need to know as citizens and what they want to know as audience members. There is, though, in that information doesn't have to be, if the information is generated, it doesn't have to be widely consumed to have an impact. So when ProPublica does a story about brain damage among soldiers in Iraq, they partner with I believe it was the Army Times, because there are a set of people with a producer demand for information whose day job relates to things like military healthcare. So there are a set of people, once the information is produced, it can reach people whose decisions should change. And then on your supply side, you're exactly right that it's very the difficulty of monetizing the positive externalities means I may not provide it. But that does, there's a hidden assumption there in that we're a world of profit, of subscription and advertising, but we can also be in a world of nonprofit and partisan, or last thing, self-expression. There are a whole set of people we don't hear from because they don't have broadband, and that gets to the access point that Penny said. But yes, you're exactly right. There's a supply and a demand side.
So it's interesting that like we haven't talked about evil hedge funds. We haven't talked about, well, you mentioned briefly, but the duopoly in the advertising market and the big platforms, trust and news. I was wondering if Larissa or Rasmus had anything more to add to what Jay had said about like why we're facing the problem we're facing. When don't you go first, Rasmus, if you want to? If not, then Larissa.
Sure. I mean, I suppose the way I see it, there are three overlapping but not identical crises, and the degree to which they exist in different countries varies quite considerably. Some of them are nearly universal, others less so. One is the question of the sustainability of independent news media that invest in professional reporting. Jay laid out some of the core issues there, though I think it's worth just noting that I think historically the business of news was never based on monetizing the positive externalities of independent reporting. It was largely based on the fact that newspaper companies in the US were advertising distribution companies who thought they were in the content business, and now they are in the content business, and they are finding that to more competitive and less profitable business when you face the demand side that Jay described. So the business is one, and of course that's intellect with the second one, which is the rise of the platforms that are capturing very large share of attention, collecting a lot of data along the way, and thus are drawing a lot of advertising that used to go to companies that invest in journalism and now go to companies that do not invest in journalism. So that's the second aspect. That one is nearly universal. In every market where people have access and governments don't restrict it, people are moving towards digital, mobile, and platform media. The third one, which I think is overlapping with this but not identical, is the fraying public connection between professional journalism and much of the public, which has, I think, sort of broadly speaking, sort of three aspects. One is the fact that journalism historically has been arguably sort of often racist and sexist and classist and pro-establishment and out of touch with many people. And as we move from low choice to high choice, people who feel that journalism doesn't represent, reflect, and respect them are engaging with other communities. So one is the sort of the lack of the reckoning with the historical injustices and shortcomings in who journalism has served. The second one is then asymmetrical political polarization, where some partisan communities believe that the press is, in the words of one famous American, the enemies of the people, which in turn also influence how people engage with journalism. And the final one is inequality, in part along lines of interest, as Jay suggested, but those lines of interest are then in turn highly correlated with class, with levels of education, levels of income. So money, yes. Platforms, yes, as well as a fraying public connection. The three are overlapping and interlinked, but they're not identical. Taming the platforms or sorting out the financing will not in itself restore the public connection between journalism and the public. Simply giving more money to media that many, I think, personally rightly regard as sort of racist, for example, will not in itself fix that problem. So I think we have quite a complicated set of problems that are on our hands, of which money is an important one, but not the only one.
Larissa, would you like to jump in?
I don't have a whole lot to add to what's been said, other than to say, the well-known fact that when you're reliant for your revenue on advertising, you get yourself into a downward spiral where the fewer eyeballs you have, the fewer advertisers want to come to you, and it starts a downward spiral. And that's been a tremendously powerful force leading to the decimation of newsrooms. The other thing I wanted to point out is there's a decline in trust that I'm sure we'll be talking about later, but that decline in trust is partly related to the decline in expertise when you have newsrooms systematically hollowed out by firing, decades of experience. So Penny's work really highlights this. Of course, the product is going to be lower quality in the end. When you have 22-year-olds rather than 42-year-olds, 62-year-olds who've been doing it for decades, you're going to get a different product. When I used to read the New York Times, I never noticed typos. Now I notice them all the time. The dearth of intermediaries means that you've got more problems in the content than you used to have, and the public knows it, even if they don't know it.
Right. One of the things I thought was fascinating in discussions with everyone during when we were taping the episodes is the kind of realization how unusual we are. That is, we consume enormous amounts of news, and that's really different than most people. I remember, maybe you could just fill us in, Rasmus. You had the figures that I remember from the conversation is something like, is this right, 3 to 6% of time on average people spend reading journalism on the web? Is that accurate?
It's in that range. Comscore is one of the analytics companies tracking that, and the share of time spent online that goes to everything that they categorize as news and information in the United States and other sort of Western democracies is normally in the sort of 3 to 5% range. The share of news of media use overall is a bit larger than that, as Jennifer Allen and a team of co-authors have shown recently. Their estimate is that in the sort of totality of people's media use, of which it's still the case that almost half is television, it's about 15% or so. That's news consumption, of course, with huge variation between sort of, crudely put, about a quarter who are sort of news lovers and consume a lot of news, about a sort of a half who are sort of daily briefers who use news a couple of times a day, and then about a quarter who are more casual briefers, and then a sort of fairly significant percentage of people who in our survey say they've consumed no news in the last month. It's worth remembering, take online, where arguably, even with a growing number of publishers implementing pay models and subscription and membership models of various sorts, a lot of really good journalism is still available free at the point of consumption or just with registration. And even with that cornucopia of supply in America, for example, the Comscore data suggests that something like half of internet users in America are not regular users of any online news at all. None. That's not about access. That's a demand and choice.
That's absolutely fascinating. We'll talk about this more tomorrow when we talk about competition policy, because the question is going to be, if there's not this demand for this thing, maybe it's not the platforms that are strangling things, though I'm sure things are more complicated than that. Let's dive into the questions about what the various kinds of structural fixes we might imagine. And maybe Rasmus, you could just kind of give us some kind of rundown of the various possibilities at this kind of somewhat high level of generality.
Sure. I mean, first I want to say, I think it's clear that the rise of the platforms has seriously challenged the existing business of news. Whether it works the way that some people assert, that challenge is a different matter, but there's no question that the competition for attention and for advertising from platform companies, in particular dominant ones like Facebook and Google, is a very serious challenge for incumbent publishers and new startups. And I think it's clear that there are some very real competition issues in the digital economy. But whether addressing those will in turn, quote unquote, fix the problem, I think is then a separate question. And I'm less convinced that while I think it's in the public interest to look at this more broadly, whether it'll help journalism narrowly, I think is a separate matter. So that's why I think it's important just to consider the fact that we have other options that have proof of concept. And while it's clear, as Paul Starr has shown in his work, that in the 20th century, America moved away from a long tradition of having sort of proactive media policy to create an enabling environment for independent journalism and news media. Other Western democracies have not turned their back on the idea that the government, without interfering with editorial, can create a more enabling environment. Jay's work is absolutely defining for the side of this that has to do with reducing the cost of reporting by making it easier for journalists to do important investigations. I think there are sort of two other clusters of things we can think about. One is what if one adopts the language of market failure and thinks about what can incentivize private for-profit actors to invest or increase their investment in independent professional journalism, what can policymakers do? And there are a number of countries in Europe, all of them, I should add, countries with very high media freedom and rankings in media freedom indices, who provide important indirect subsidies for private publishers, VAT and sales tax exemptions, for example, for both digital and print products, that provide direct cash support. For example, in Denmark, where news publishers are given a cash subsidy based on their investment in editorial, so not their distribution cost or their overheads or depending on their total revenues, but based on the headcounts and the investment in their actual newsrooms. That's cut off at the top to privilege primarily the needs of smaller publishers, so local publishers and niche publishers, so a way of rebalancing the winner takes most and concentration dynamics in the media market. So direct subsidies. Secondly, you have various forms of support that are about enhancing the sector as a whole by investing in retraining of journalists and applied research that helps the industry as a whole, so not tied to individual publishers. And then, of course, you have, in addition to these interventions, or for that matter, the idea in New Zealand of a journalism fund that a publisher can apply to fund important investigations, the way that we already do things with arts councils and research councils. These are 4 different ways for policymakers to support independent professional journalism by private publishers. Beyond incentivizing private investment, of course, there are non-market approaches too, as Jay alluded to. In America, of course, nonprofit public media and nonprofit media like the Texas Tribune and the 19th are the most sort of visible example of this, where you create vehicles that can receive philanthropic and donation funding, and you incentivize that support from individuals, foundations, and the like. That is one area. By far the most important in Europe and in countries like Japan and South Korea is public service media. They are not without complications, but there is mountains of evidence that demonstrates that the investment of public resources in genuinely independent public service media can create a more informed and more equally informed public. So there is no question that there are options on the table that have proof of concept, that have evidence behind them, that are available. Nothing is without complications. Nothing is without some sort of risks and limitations. But fundamentally, these are things we can do right now if we wanted to. And whether we do it or not, that's a political choice, just as not doing it is a political choice. And it's a matter of sort of personal tastes, whether one is primarily interested in things that might command relatively broad political support to avoid a further politicization and sort of partisan polarization around the media, or whether one is happy to push ahead with quite partisan reforms that may have only narrow support and thus risk being overturned at the next election. But there are options, and we can make these choices tomorrow if we wanted to.
Thanks. Let me just if I could summarize it. So there were basically 7 options that were mentioned. One would be direct cash subsidies. Second would be indirect subsidies, like through VAT reductions. So basically decreasing the cost by decreasing the tax bill. Systemic support, training, providing skills and resources that the entire industry could use, competitive grants in the way in which arts and science works, independent public service media with secure public funding, nonprofit news organizations, and then finally, other forms of lowering the cost of doing investigative reporting, like as in, making FOIA requests easier. I was, now we get to the fun part because each of the panelists has different views about which levers to pull, and the question is whether they're complements or whether they're substitutes or rivals is a question I'll be interested in. What I'd like to ask first, start off with Rasmus, and then move to Jay, and then Larissa. What if you had to? What works? Let's just be like crude about it. Now, I understand what you're going to say is that, well, it depends on the political context and blah, blah, blah. But like you're now President Nielsen of the United States. What do you do? What do you push? What do you think will work? Do you think the Denmark solution of direct subsidies, do you think that that's something that is even a possibility in the United States?
Well, President Nielsen is here tonight to announce that the state of our union is strong. I mean, I consider the American people blessed not to have me for a president. I don't want to sidestep the question, but I will say that I think where research can be most useful is in trying to help citizens and decision makers think about the options that are available and the likely consequences of the choices at hand, both intended and unintended. And that's where I think research can be helpful. And the options I've outlined are options that I believe all have both proof of concept. There are places in the world where these things work. They have evidence behind them that they have sort of significant desirable consequences. None of them are without limitations or shortcomings, as said. And those I think are worth sort of recognizing, but on balance, these are all things that I would confidently recommend for the consideration of policymakers, at least in countries where there is respect for freedom of the media, so they are not means of media capture. It's a sort of a more question sort of political analysis and personal preference, where one stands on the sort of spectrum from being, writing your own sort of list to Santa Claus and saying, this is what the world should do tomorrow, versus saying, look, there are many important things in life that we don't agree about, and on some of those, there is nothing wrong with having really sharp changes from administration to administration. But then there are other things on which, with all the shortcomings and limitations that come with aspiring for some form of bipartisan support, it might still make sense to seek it. And I suppose that when I look at Europe, the countries in Europe that I would sort of broadly speaking say have media policies I think have quite a lot of virtues going for them. The German-speaking countries, the Low Countries, the Nordic countries, the UK and Ireland to different degrees. I would say that one of the features of those media policy environments has been that ideas that in America are, I think, quite narrowly associated with very progressive, very liberal, even sort of social democratic or socialist orientations of various sorts, quite radical in an American context. In reality, in Europe, have been based on a broad political compromise between social democratic or labor parties and Christian democratic parties who all had different things that they wanted to achieve. The left parties wanted greater equality in access to information and a reflection of a broader, more popular culture. And parties on the right wanted the protection and a sort of perpetuation, if you will, of a national community and a national culture. This was the trade, if you will. The left got equality, and the right got sort of a national community and national identity, if you will. And it seems to me that is a sort of a broad compromise that obviously limits, if you will, the ability to radically innovate in policy, but it does create some protections against the kind of sort of political attacks that I think can quite quickly result from changes. There are other areas of politics where, you know, my personal preferences might be more radical and for more sort of drastic reform, and why I would be less keen on broader bipartisan support. But when I look at America, where I was fortunate to live for some years, it doesn't strike me as a society in which any sane person would want public opinion about the media to become more partisan and polarized than it is. So the idea of sort of pushing through reforms on quite a narrow partisan base strikes me as something that would result in some quite negative and foreseeable consequences that I frankly don't think would serve the American public or American journalism particularly well. In that there is already as a large part of the American public, they're very alienated from the media. And I think there is a very real risk that that could be further exacerbated if they came to see the media not just as out of touch with them, but as sort of an organ of influence put upon this earth to brainwash them in various thoughts by people that they fundamentally don't like and don't care for.
And that was super helpful and informative. I want to move to Jay, then Larissa. But Jay, I know from our conversations earlier that you are not a fan of the government giving money to media organizations. And actually, it seems to me that out of the seven options that Rasmus had listed, really you go for the last one, lowering the costs of investigative journalism. I was actually curious as if you could talk about the skepticism you have about certain types of maybe European models of handling these problems transplanted to the United States, and what you think we should do about it.
You cut out just briefly. Was this for Larissa or me?
No, that was for Jay, and then I'll go to Larissa.
Oh, okay. So you're asking an economist to be skeptical about some of those. Well, if you do look across, there have been correlation studies that show if you look across the world that greater government involvement with the media often are correlated with adverse outcomes. We do praise the BBC and NHK as exemplary, but if you look in other countries, government involvement in the media can be a negative. But Rasmus was talking about were some very targeted things, but I have to say that the reason that I like to focus on cost of stories is, first of all, that those types of policies are content neutral and platform agnostic. Whether it's going to be advertising or nonprofit or subscription, those tools that help you find the story could be used regardless of the funding model. So I like that. I like that aspect of it. And the other part of this is that even though I'm a skeptic, I think you asked in an interview that discussion we had, you didn't make me president, you gave me a magic wand and said, if I could do one thing, what would I do? And I said, I would like the government to embrace the idea that there's a market failure of public goods and positive externalities involved here. And then you characterize that as low aspiration. But for an economist, I think that that would be wonderful, because if the government would embrace that idea of market failure, it's like saying, I now have a multiple set of wishes, because then the NSF does R&D on this, and then we get real FOIA reform. So I think that's a partial answer to your question. I know down the road we'll talk about FOIA and computational journalism, but you're right. I went with the cost side in part because I think that it sidesteps some of the other problems.
Gotcha. Thank you, Larissa. Could you give us the right answer?
Well, so I've been looking at the question of lowering the cost by changing the baseline or default liability rules and regulations, especially as part of First Amendment jurisprudence. And so the existing regime was developed in an area where the media were profitable and powerful, and the jurisprudence implicitly relies on a vision or image of them as profitable and powerful. And some of those doctrines now are unsuited in an era where the media is relatively weak and can't use a kind of market power to perform its functions as it once did.
So, I mean, so what would the structural fix be here? What would be the policy lever that you would pull that would help deal with this?
Well, I'll give you one example. So in current jurisprudence, the media has very strong, what I would call negative rights. In other words, freedom from government censorship. So you can't have prior restraints. You can't punish seditious libel very easily. You can't have compelled publication of what editors would prefer to withhold. But the First Amendment rarely, very rarely, gives the press a claim to government assistance when it's doing its job of checking abuses of power or informing the citizenry. So, for example, there's no right of any kind to most information in the hands of the government. And the idea is that the media will be powerful enough and have enough resources to extract that information, either by persuasion or by lobbying to get legislation mandating its release. And also, the media is not free from normal liability regimes that might impair news gathering. So the media gets no special rights. And so if you flip some of those assumptions, well, first off, I think you should flip some of those assumptions because the implicit vision of the press upon which they're based no longer exist. And then if you do flip some of those assumptions, you end up doing things like creating positive rights to have certain information in the hands of government, and that creates an obligation on government to deliver certain kinds of information. Ronell's written brilliantly about this, about is there any information, for example, for the executive branch to do things like have a press conference or to provide factual information rather than, lies or propaganda. That would be one way to change the cost structure for gathering the information that citizens need.
I'm going to say the same thing I said to Jay, to you, Larissa. Is that going to do it? I mean, like, that is one.
You want a one-shot answer?
No. But by accepting,
like in one spell swoop.
No. I was going to say, to accept invitation on this panel did not mean solving the problem. But I guess I want to ask whether this idea of lowering the costs of news gathering is going to do anything much to deal with the market failures that Jay so clearly described at the beginning. I mean, it's like, if your marginal cost of production is zero, like, then you can't lower it anymore. So the question is this one of those things where you're like, this is the best I got, this is a real problem, this is what I'm going to do, or say, no, actually the market failure here is not so large that we can't actually make up a huge amount through according legal positive rights instead of just the purely negative rights that we're so used to.
Well, I think you're going to have to take a multi-factored approach. And I think that's the beauty of this conference, because it's going to take lots of different approaches to solve the problem. Like, I love ProPublica. I'd love to see that model generalized more. ProPublica alone can't solve the problem, right? But 100 ProPublicas would be a start. Yeah, I don't think there's a one, I don't think there's a one and done solution to this complex issue that's evolved over the last 25 years.
Could we talk about money? Like, I want to, so I know that Rasmus is I would just say, is at least Danish curious about this model of providing cash subsidies to press organizations and doing it in a way which is really, as Rasmus mentioned, doing it doing it in a way that's sensitive to the editorial content, to the size, to make sure it's not the big legacy media that are getting all the money, to do it and to do it in a way that there are these external controls. I was wondering if Rasmus, whether you could maybe convince Jay a little bit more or persuade him a bit that actually this is not the road to serfdom?
Well, I mean, I would just say first I was impressed by Jay's response to your question about the magic wand, which I think was sort of basically the way that an economist would ask the genie for more wishes, which is, I'll try to keep that in mind if I meet a genie at some point in time. Look, I mean, I'm with, I don't think there is a sort of a conflict here per se, but, I think, Jay's work, I think, is a very important way of trying to make sure we get as much sort of public interest bang for our buck in journalism. There are a lot of things that governments can do to enable reporting. The fact that they aren't doing it, I think, is indicative of sort of where this is on the list of priorities. Let's not be naive. I mean, it's no secret that powerful people don't like to be held to account, and powerful institutions don't like to be held to account. I mean, it doesn't help anybody to be naive about this stuff. Of course that applies to governments too. Of course it applies to politicians too. It would be stupid not to recognize that. We can hope that they'll do better. We can ask for it. We can suggest it. But will it happen? Maybe. If it does, great. I am with Larissa on sort of just following that with the observation that there logically has to be some reporters for reporters to benefit from this. And I obviously Jay is I think completely on board with that as well. And I suspect that the line of argumentation may also have something to do with a sort of an analysis of the political reality on the ground in the United States, where being Danish curious may not be a crime, but it's probably not sort of necessarily the sort of the straight path to a sort of major party nomination, let alone the White House. And I get that. And that's why I'm quite invested in this idea of sort of broad-based political and public support, which I think is quite important for media policy. What I would say is simply that I think we can benefit from trying to be a sort of bit more granular and precise about what the problems are we're trying to solve, right? So if the sort of definition of the problem is, how can American newspapers make the same money that they did in the 1990s, then you're looking at what, a $40 billion a year problem? Good luck convincing Congress, or let alone the American taxpayer, to solve that problem. And it's not at all obvious that that in itself is a problem that merits a public intervention. You can think about it the second way then, is to say, well, okay, if we look at the sort of roughly 25,000 net loss of full-time reporting jobs in the United States in the last couple of decades, if you look at that as a funding problem and say, okay, the Bureau of Labor Statistics says the median salary for a reporter is about 50K, let's say 50% overheads, then you're looking at, say, a $2 billion a year problem. That's a very different kind of problem to try to get to. What if you don't care about the total headcount, but about, say, particular categories of public interest reporting? What if what you're concerned about is, say, state-house reporters, where I think we're down from, down maybe net 1,000. If we're looking at sort of trying to solve a problem that's about 1,000 full-time reporters across America, then we're looking at a $75 million a year problem. There are different ways of thinking about the scale and scope of these problems, and matching them up against examples of things that we have reason to believe work. As I said, all of them have different limitations. The Danish ones too. And I completely recognize that, you know, the United States right now is a country where I think you'd probably struggle to build bipartisan support for celebrating the 4th of July. So I'm not sort of holding my breath, waiting for Congress to vote overwhelmingly in favor of some joint sort of Marshall Plan for American journalism. But the fact that other countries are able to do this is a reminder that such things are possible, and that with appropriate safeguards and designs, they can be done in a way where, in Denmark there is a communist paper that advocates the overthrow of the bourgeois capitalist state, that receives money from the bourgeois capitalist state to make that argument. And there are ministers who are, forced out of their office, governments that are held to account, important investigations done by newspapers that I respect, even if I don't personally always appreciate every one of them's individual editorial line at a personal level, that are able to do this better and with more reporters than they would in the absence of such arrangements. I'm not saying that all of the world should become like Denmark, though I suppose there are some parts of the world that might in some ways be better off if they were more like Denmark, but that's just an accident of me being very privileged in where I come from. It's just to say, I think that sometimes in these discussions, it becomes a little bit like if we're trying to think about how do we solve sort of traffic problems in a major urban area, we don't need to talk about hyperloops and drone taxis and driverless cars when there are perfectly actionable policies available that have proof of concept. Sort out the bike lanes, get some buses and light rail, and you can get the job done. It's a choice. And it's a political challenge to build broad-based support for those choices. I think sometimes we sort of risk intellectualizing these problems a little bit, and I say that as an intellectual, and intellectual is a word that I broadly would say sort of has a positive connotations for me. I suppose that may be a vocational weakness, but I think sometimes we're looking for sort of philosophical depth charges to solve surface problems. There are things that we know can work, whether they are politically feasible in a particular country or whether they are desirable in certain political environments. Those are separate questions. And those I don't really think that social scientists like myself are well positioned to answer. Those are for citizens and politicians and rights activists, I would say, to sort of have a full-throated view on. It's very satisfying to sort of write a book saying this is the way the world must look, and everybody who doesn't agree with me are evil or stupid. I get the emotional satisfaction of that, but it's not something I consider to be sort of a particularly constructive approach to informing citizens' decision making and elected officials, because it tends to sort of implicitly or explicitly suggest that people who don't agree with you are in fact evil or stupid or both, and it doesn't strike me as a way to build broad-based support for public policy.
Thank you. This is a perfect setup for Jay. So is computational journalism the hyperloop of media? Why don't you, I had never heard of computational journalism from before. It sounded really cool to me. Could you maybe explain what that is and how it might be used to dent some of this problem that we're talking about?
Sure. I've been told never to use the word with donors. I'm supposed to say support for democracy because it's a key term. Computational journalism is stories by, through, and about algorithms. So stories by algorithms. Today, the AP writes quarterly earnings reports with software. Stories through algorithms, that's the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, scraping medical society websites and using machine learning to find examples of doctors who had engaged in sexual harassment and were still practicing. That was a Pulitzer finalist. Stories about algorithms, that's the markup, or that's ProPublica's machine bias stories looking at Facebook and discrimination in job or housing advertising. I think that it's here today unevenly distributed. If you go back to 2008, I put in a grant proposal for the National Science Foundation on a Center for Computational Journalism because I wanted to see how they would react. I knew they wouldn't fund it, but I wanted to see what the reaction was. And the reaction was bimodal. One set of people said, public interest data mining is too hard. You'll never be able to do it. And the other set of people said, this is trivial. We've solved all these problems in the war on terror. We already know how to analyze transcripts and look for breakdowns. And I thought that is really the problem. I know government through DARPA and other means funds excellent software to monitor us, but the NSF does not fund software to develop tools for journalists to monitor the government. And two very specific examples that shows that it works. One is the Stanford Open Policing Project. Students here did FOIA requests at all 50 states. Cheryl Phillips and Sherrod Goyle, two professors here, collected more than 160 million police stop records and trained 100 journalists at conferences to use the data. So if you clean the data and develop a story recipe, you can develop highly localized stories, and those stories resulted in changes in cities and different states. So that's lowering the cost of discovering stories. Another challenge right now is, this relates to Rasmus's discussion of reporters. Imagine that a given radius or community might only be able to support 4 or 5 reporters, but what would those reporters be capable of doing? There's a project at the big local news program at Stanford called Agenda Watch that scripts their and agendas of public meetings all across the country. And a reporter faces the challenge, where do I go? Which meeting do I attend? And so what our students are doing are building prototypes in beta that allow you to say, these are the topics I'm interested in, where shall I go? And then afterwards, analyzing the transcripts using audio, realizing that when there's hubbub, when people raise their voices, there might be news, you can actually find where to look. So those type of R&D projects could be funded by the government. And I will say the software does exist today. Law firms have great software. Companies, major media outlets have great software. Local accountability reporters don't. And this also relates to something Martha Minow said earlier today. Philanthropists looking at the local news ecosystem often take the approach of adding one more reporter, which I really like that. But imagine if that report had better tools. So there is a certain type of R&D that philanthropy could support that would make it easier, because local institutions break down in predictable ways. And if you have the data and you have the tool, you can spot that.
Thank you. That was actually really helpful. Larissa, the Reuters report that that Rasmus and his team had produced, he talked about the 3 F's: funding, freedom, funding, and the future. We've been talking about funding and to some extent the future. I want to talk about freedom, press freedoms. Obviously, this is we've just come off in the United States, you know, having a president who, fair to say, anti-press presidency, and there have been concerns about attacks and various legal actions against journalists. Do you see the law in the United States moving in a dangerous direction vis-a-vis protecting journalists? And is your view about positive rights, might that not be used to protect journalists against some of the threats that we're seeing?
So one of the things that's really interesting to me, has always been interesting to me ever since 9/11, is how public opinion shapes judicial opinions, especially at the Supreme Court level. And so the Watergate era shaped judicial opinions concerning the media, because there's a vision of what the media is, what it does, how it acts. And now, but there's a tremendous amount of rhetoric in the cases of that era about the role of the press as the fourth estate, this unofficial branch of government that checks the three official branches and that has the power and the resources to do so, including the legal resources. And that was based, that vision of the press is partly based on the reality on the ground. The press were out there fighting for major victories that redounded not just to their benefit, but to the benefit of all speakers. That stopped. And the rhetoric in the decisions, even in that area, even in that era, and Ronell and Sonia West have, Ronell Anderson-Jones and Sonia West have shown this in their work. Even in that era, where they weren't giving the media positive rights, there was lots of dicta, kind of this golden age of the press, and the press performs this democratic role. Well, not only now in the Roberts Court do you not see that kind of press praising dicta. Instead, you see dicta that says the press are just like any other money grubbing corporations. That's straight out of Citizens United, for example. And there's this deep, deep cynicism about the press and whether they do or are capable of playing a special role in our democracy. So in some ways, Rasmus, you said it pays not to be naive. In some ways, it might be naive to think that this court right now is going to do anything to benefit the press, given that kind of ground level recognition that the press plays a special role in democracy seems to be off the table. I think I've gotten off your question a little bit, but the idea was, is there a change with the context for freedom in those judicial decisions? Well, I'll tell you one thing. I had never heard a justice question New York Times versus Sullivan and the propriety of protecting the media from defamation liability when they criticize public officials and not having seditious libel, actions brought against them. But once Justice Thomas opened that door, then we've seen a lot more rhetoric about how bad the media is and they should be sued more for defamation and they should have fewer defamation protections. And that was picked up today by, I guess, Judge Silberman in dissent. I haven't had a chance to read that opinion yet. But so this idea that I thought was crazy at the time because New York Times versus Sullivan was such subtle law now is not seeming so crazy at all. And I do think there are threats out there. I remember once going to a Practicing Law Institute conference, probably 15 years ago, and the then counsel for the New York Times said that he had not had a single domestic defamation case against the New York Times that year. And I thought that was extraordinary, but it represented that there's this settled body of law and there's this public consensus that it's not worth it to sue the media in the United States. Well, certainly that's off. I mean, my core area of scholarship is defamation. I was telling my husband last night that I was reading an article called The Golden Age of Defamation. So that is something that has ramped up in a big bad way. And oftentimes these suits are not about winning, but they're about punishing the media. And the court hasn't taken a real defamation case in the last 25 years. So they just don't, it's not their issue. They don't seem to care much about that issue. They don't take media law cases, as a matter of course, because it's really not their issue. So I don't know if I answered your question or not, but that's my answer.
I mean, you certainly did. I mean, that Judge Silberman dissent this morning, we're basically, forget that he was challenging New York Times versus Sullivan, but basically saying the New York Times is a shill for the Democratic Party. I mean, to say that, directly in a judicial opinion is kind of,
mouth dropping. Right?
Yeah, right. Sean. Yeah, one thing you see here is two things coming together that we've been talking about today, which is on the one hand, the funding problems and the way in which media organizations pulling out from local communities is engendering a degree of distrust of the media is now bleeding into other areas. It's not just that we won't be able to pay journalists, but like, will they ever be able to get insurance for defamation, or will they be protected from being attacked? And so this is a very serious problem.
There's another piece to the problem too. Sorry to jump back in, but there's another piece to the problem. That's the funding of lawyers. And, you know, it's an interesting development that I don't know if everybody is aware of, that increasingly there are First Amendment litigation clinics popping up at law schools. As a law school dean, I feel with you know, the top journalism school in the country, I feel obliged to mention that this is the way we're filling in some of the gap with the lack of resources that newspapers have, and particularly local newspapers. I wish we had a media clinic here. We don't, but I wish we did.
If I may, Scott,
please,
just on this,
jump in.
I think one of the things I find sort of personally challenging, but also important in doing the kind of work that I do, is to hold in one's head at the same time what Larissa just described, which is that in much of the world, there is a war on journalism being fought by powerful people who don't want to be held to account. And there was a moment in time in which there was sort of a relatively broad-based political and elite consensus during the Cold War that this should be sort of kept in bay by various legal protections. Like many other forms of Cold War consensus, that broke down. And I think this is sort of basically sort of eroding even in sort of stable liberal democracies. The US is one example, but it's not alone. We're seeing, I think, a lot of these sort of erosions. And of course, in much of the rest of the world, there is very real democratic backsliding that is far, far worse than this. And in that sense, I think it's incredibly important to try to shore up those protections and draw attention to them, as Larissa and others do in their work, as how important they are and how striking it is when they are not being defended. What I find challenging but important, and I think Larissa is thinking about the same thing, I'm sure, is it's also, I think, important to recognize and hold in one's head that there are many people in our societies who have good reasons to not regard the press as quite as amazing as the press likes to regard itself, right? And even in its sort of proudest moments, right, you know, the American sort of press of sort of Watergate in that period is also the press, you know, that covered the AIDS epidemic in a way that the LGBT community will look back on as incredibly bigoted and stereotypical and harmful. It's a press where it was absolutely routine, still is in some papers, to run mugshots in a way that I think are personally considered to be clearly racist. And that was a routine part of news coverage and the business of news as well in local news. It's, you know, an industry that covered Iran-Contra in a way that made it sound as if the scandal was about the hyphen between Iran and Contra, rather than what was actually going on in each of the two instances. And I say this as someone who is, you know, do what I do because I care deeply about the principles and promise of independent professional journalism with its imperfections. But I think it's really important for those of us who do this, in particular journalists who work at privileged institutions or academics like myself who work at privileged institutions, to not embrace a sort of an airbrushed view of journalism. I mean, in the United States, when Al Narvath said that Gannett is pronounced money, or when Les Monville says, you know, Donald Trump, he may be bad for America, but he's great for CBS. You know, it's not completely unreasonable if there are people out there who don't think that journalism is quite as lily, you know, white-handed and sort of separate and distinct and purely principled as it, you know, would like to be and sometimes is. It's a human institution with all those imperfections. And I think a sort of a sometimes a tendency to not quite be willing to subject itself to the same kind of scrutiny that it likes to subject other institutions to. And I think that is, as I said at the outset, one of the three sort of interlocking crises we face today is that reckoning becomes is as urgent as it ever was, but it's more consequential to not confront those imperfections and weaknesses in a society in which people have other choices, because they are making them now and they're turning their backs on journalism. And without that strong public connection, who's going to be there to stand up for journalists if the political elite and others start to sort of chip away at the protections that reporters historically have enjoyed? No one.
Yeah, well, that was sober. Thank you. I have a question here from David Green, which I'm going to read out. Are there demand side solutions to increasing the value people not on this call place on journalism? Does civic education help at all? Does having journalistic voices more representative of the audiences help? Since this was a demand side question, I'm going to ask Jay whether he would jump in. Is there sense that you have that we're just not teaching our students to appreciate journalism? Because in some sense, what Rasmus says, that maybe we actually have to we look at the profession in a bit with rose-colored glasses, certainly after the Trump years.
I do believe that there is research that shows that teaching news literacy can make people more effective at being readers. There's interesting work that just came out that is a field experiment with Facebook, that when people were exposed to news from an ideological outlet, not theirs, that they did read it, and it didn't change their policy positions, but it did make them less likely to demonize their opponents. I do relate this to what Larissa was talking about. There was a case in North Carolina, a defamation case against the News and Observer. The News and Observer is something that I write about in my book, Democracy's Detectives. It has a great tradition of investigative reporting. But in the closing arguments, our lawyers in the court said basically, send them a message. It was basically demonizing the press. It was very popular in a Southern populist way. And that does have a chilling effect. I also note that Steve Waldman is on the call, and I think he'll be talking tomorrow about refundable tax credits as a way to put some choice on the demand side.
Any thoughts, Larissa or Rasmus, about? Do you want to jump in, Steve? Be my guest, please.
I think I accidentally got put on this thread, so I'll be very brief because I'll have my say tomorrow. I apologize, but since Jay called me out,
No, please go ahead.
Well, it's to the question of, are there ways of helping journalism that don't have government interference or manipulation of the media? And the one I think is most interesting is this idea of a refundable tax credit that consumers would use to buy a news subscription or donate to a local nonprofit. So it's a little like the charitable deduction in that its power is in enhancing the consumer choice and doesn't involve the government making a grant decision about who to support. But I'll be quiet now.
If I can just add on it, I'll say two things. One is that on the idea of media literacy, I would just point to Dana Boyd's really important work, where I think she's right to say that in media literacy, we've often been very focused on teaching critical thinking and helping people develop tools to tear things apart and dissect them. And I think there is an argument to be made that we may have sort of lost the sort of more affirmative element of helping people make decisions about what is good enough in a world of imperfect options. And that might be an important part of media literacy education at all levels. The other thing I would just say is that, and I say this as, I think academics can sometimes sort of fall into the same thing, that whenever we start talking about changing the demand side, I suppose I am reminded of Brecht's observation about the government wanting to dissolve the people and elect another one. I think it might be easier to reform journalism than it is to reform the public. And I suppose that I would like the public to be the one reforming itself. just as I would like journalism to be the one performing itself. You know, media literacy, yes, but I think the work starts at home, I would say.
Larissa, do you get a sense as dean that your students that are coming in are less have less passion for First Amendment work in the way in which I feel like when I went to law school?
I think they're much more skeptical of, for example, the argument that we can't regulate hate speech. I think there's a tension between some of their commitments to the First Amendment and their commitments to other things like equality in ways that disturbs those of us who are still wedded to the libertarian conception of press freedom that exists in the United States. But no, I mean, I get a sense they're as civically minded, as civically oriented. And some of them do have training in, particularly in critical thinking. I mean, of course, that's what the LSAT prep is supposed to teach you to do is to be trained in critical thinking. But they've also got training in here at the University of Missouri in the value of news, because that is the most, we have extraordinary news outlets here in this little small college town because of the university. So my students come in with a pretty good sense of it.
Thanks. We have a question here from Jennifer Borg. Regarding demand side, do any of the panelists think that the medium of publication distribution contributes to the decline of the newspaper industry? It's expensive to print and truck a newspaper, but readers would spend hours with the New York Times print format and experience delight and, I'm sorry, the reading of, it's actually hard to read off of the chat, but
It's about the difference between a push and a pull system.
Right. Yeah, can you go, because I
Yeah. So the answer is, it's kind of like the answer about books versus the Kindle. When you go to the bookstore and you're looking along the shelves, serendipity takes hold and you find and read things that you would never otherwise find. And that it's damaging when you have, I mean, it's same in the music industry, right? When you can buy an individual song versus an album. It hurts because you don't have to buy the whole paper to get the article you want necessarily, particularly with the current model. But I mean, I know it, I will just speak personally. I read a lot more from a lot more, a much bigger diversity of sources. So maybe I read fewer in each individual paper, but I read much more aggregate across papers. And I expect that's what most of the public does as well. And it's not, I mean, that genie's not going back in the bottle for sure.
Yeah. Jay.
I had significant FOIA reform on my policy bingo card. So I wanted to say that I know we're at the end, but I hope that people will think about FOIA reform. There was a great report put out by Accountability 2021 that talks about that. And if you look at the thousands of investigations that have been done, that are recognized in investigative reporters and editors, they often involve government documents that are extracted through FOIA.
Right. I mean, or we might make sure that the U.S. government doesn't classify everything. That would be another. That would be another, like, kind of real transparency reform about the national security state. You know what? We are out of time. I want to thank our panelists who've been crazy amazing. Jay, Larissa, Rasmus, thank you so much for joining us. And we look forward to continuing this tomorrow.